This also will show you that it's not that straightforward as to say ego and bust. Or perhaps English language need to be expanded, reevaluated, so that we can understand and distinguish above all else between the healthy ego and the unhealthy selfishness. Because it seems to me modern spirituality is lost its plot. And a lot of cases, world now famous teachers speak about the ego, and everything is being bashed or painted with the same brush, painted away with the same brush, when in fact, it is much more complex affair. So here, what I want to bring to your attention. In order for consciousness to express itself, or in order for any diversity to exist, any multiplicity to exist, there has to be a principle, right? A principle, energetic principle, responsible for that which will be the very core of individuality, or something which we call uniqueness. Something which is different, one substance different from another substance. In order for that difference to exist, there has to be some principle at work. So there are at least 3 categories being recognized. The first ultimate category within consciousness is the very principle of Aham. And last Thursday we spoke about it. Aham literally means I am. In fact, there's even like certain rhyming, a certain similarity. I am Aham. I am Aham. Aham literally stands in the Sanskrit grammar and in the grammar of of various spiritual traditions as that. Aham as the supreme principle. Aham as the supreme principle of universal identity. And the same we could say, if we translate into English, I am. Whatever is, I am. Whatever happens to us, I am. Above all else, I am. I am alive or I am dead, I am. I'm empty-handed or I'm the ruler of this world, right? I am. I'm this miserable little puny being, or I am the sovereign of the world, I am. And so forth. I'm black, I'm white, I'm fat, I'm skinny, I'm what have you, right? I'm pretty, I'm ugly, and so forth. The polarity, the duality comes from whatever comes next to I am. So Aham is that centrality. Aham is that, literally, that I amness. Then, in order for Aham to express itself, there is this literally term known as Ahamkara. And Ahamkara variously translated. If you look into the Sanskrit dictionary, you will have various translations from principle of individuation to ego consciousness, right? Ahamkara. But let's go to the root of the term Ahamkara. Aham plus Karana here. Kara here starts for Karana. Karana is the body. So anything that has the body would have to have Ahamkara. So Ahamkara is that universal principle responsible for the individuation full stop. But individuation of what? In Indian philosophy there is this concept of different tattvas, of different suchness, of the different categories. So there are pure categories. For instance, there is a category of cosmic intelligence, a cosmic being, right? Somewhere very, very high in the hierarchy of that creation of the cosmos, right? At the very, very basic of creation. There's this universal principle, this universal intelligence which underlies everything. It is very close to the ground of being itself, to that very, very I, to the absolute. It is maybe a first movement within the absolute, or the second, or the third. Doesn't matter. It is intelligence itself. It is the cosmic intelligence. And it has a term, Mahat. In Sanskrit, it is known as Mahat. So Ahamkara, it's literally individuation of Mahat, individuation of the principle of the underlying intelligence of the universe itself. So Ahamkara is that which makes every blade of grass different, every flavor different, every flower different, every planet and every universe, every man and woman, every twin. Because even if we look at the identical twins, they still have unique characteristics, and it is precisely because Ahamkara underlies everything. It is Aham that gained the body. And additionally, there is another term, Asmita, variously translated. And don't get lost here, because if you go back home, Google, and then you will discover that Asmita poses the most problems. Because in some cases that term Asmita is translated as literally also ego, selfishness, right? But also, in some schools of Indian philosophy, especially in yogic schools, Asmita actually has a positive connotation. But it is within and reserved for scholars. So I would not worry with that now. So if you stumble on Asmita being described as something positive, as that discrimination of the right action, discrimination of the right action of the perceiver and perceived, and that precise cognition. But I want you to now simply have this term Asmita as an additional take on ego, because also it means selfishness. So as we can see, the different ways with which we can see and trace the origins of ego. That what is being bashed by most modern teachers is obviously that what is known as selfishness, egotism, excessive contraction born of misperception and misconception that all this is just mine. This is simply mine, on the account that I own it. And of course, because we live in time where our culture very much supports that, even on the social structure, that is getting and being ingrained from a very, very early age. Very early, and from the very, very early age, there is this recognition. However, there is also a primal force at play. That very above mentioned Ahamkara. And this is what you need to understand and have a very clear insight. Ahamkara is that which keeps intact your organism. It prevents your organism from being destroyed by bacteria of billion kinds. Because if not for Ahamkara, there will be no immunological functioning here. weakened Ahamkara leads precisely to that, weakening of the immune system. And it is what many spiritually advanced people, spiritually advanced beings suffer from, precisely because of the lack of proper understanding on the role and the place of Ahamkara in this whole process. So when an awakened teacher comes and tells you, and I'm not going to mention names here, but most of you know who are the bashing egos, you have to take to the account that this is just the experience of this person, but what is his or her experience with that on the actual neurophysiological plane? Because otherwise we're entering very murky waters or shaky grounds here upon which we want to build this whole process of self-realization. Because if we undermine our Ahamkara right at the very early stage, we are undermining the very ability of this physiology to carry this process throughout into the culminative states of high states of consciousness. So this, for instance, what we have spoken about, need to be understood from a very clear perspective. Perhaps you want to put light as well there in that room, please. So the ego, the unhealthy ego, is simply that excessive contraction, that excessive selfishness, that is simply born of misperception, misconception, that somehow we feel we are separate. We are separate beings, therefore we need to guard our territory. And with guarding our territory comes everything else. It fosters and strengthens our ego. It fosters and strengthens that selfishness until we evolve. At some point we could say that even if we look at the trajectory of the evolution of simply growth of human body, psyche and nervous system and mind, we can see how that at some point is actually necessary at some point. Because in order to have a greater understanding of who we are, we need to go through the phase of that intensely acute, lived and savored individuality. So this is when it is roughly coincides with the
Rats in the wall.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's enlightened as well. You know.
It's coming for a darshan too.
Activated. So this whole trajectory from kicks in about the age of puberty, and we suddenly very acutely feel our space, our needs. It may start much earlier. It has healthy reasons until we develop and allow the development of that inner world. We literally build that, we have a greater sense of what is going on inside of us. The games with, like all this childhood that, that we've been playing and, spending our time, suddenly goes on the foreground. The matters of our psyche, the matters of our inner world becomes primary. And that also intensifies that selfishness. Teenagers are selfish. They're selfish, they're known for that. Young people are more selfish. But as we develop, as we evolve, obviously, at some point, when we want to express ourselves in the world, when we want to project ourselves, when we want to somehow leave mark in the environment, because this is all what it is all about, it's that same principle of Ahamkara expressing itself. Then we embrace life from all its shadows and from all its places, and we also have a greater ability for introspection. So we become less maybe obsessed with what is happening here. Some sooner, some later. But essentially, we can see that it becomes counterproductive. We enter relationship. Then there's first love, like that. Maybe the first honeymoon of love in a sense that first love is very, very pure, in a sense that we're very giving in that relationship. But then there comes the territory, there comes a phase where we have to fight for preservation of our identity, not being swallowed by the relationship. It happens to everyone. I'm just showing you this dynamics on the horizontal plane, even how that all these aspects of individuality are being at play. But if it is continuously works as an imposition, then obviously that selfishness becomes counterproductive, because what it does, it begins to obstruct the very light of our own awareness within, because of this excessive identification with this body-mind structure. However, the role of the Ahamkara is not that. The role of and the purpose of Ahamkara is not to usurp the light of consciousness. Ahamkara exists in the first place to glorify the variety that exists in consciousness. This is what you need to understand. You need to understand that no matter how far you jump off the cliff of your individual self, you will always remain who you are on individual level. At least walk out of this gathering with that. There's not a person who have jumped out of their skin and become just a floating absolute.
Actually, I've noticed that some saints and sages become more distinct, more individual.
Well, we're coming to that. We're coming to that precisely because of that example with the beating of the cream into butter. The separation has to take place first, and this is the separation also in terms of the separation which is often accompanied, right, or a byproduct of first awakening. The very classical term, cosmic state of consciousness or witnessing state of consciousness, is precisely that. Witnessing state of consciousness is characterized by ability of having that acute and clear understanding and experience of the self as opposed to passing phenomena, as opposed to what is phenomenal. That rupture is actually very, very evident in the awakening and in the dawn of witnessing state of consciousness. It is a successful separation. We've managed to separate the water from the butter, which now would have to be fried in order for it to be clarified and turned into gold of pure consciousness. So you see, this is very important. This is very important to understand that there is, in simple psychological terms, healthy and unhealthy ego. Not ego as such, and then pure consciousness. It just simply doesn't exist. That doesn't work like that. If you understand and had experienced enough, you would know that it simply doesn't work like that. There are many cases when people lost themselves to a severe cases of depersonalization. In other words, they're egoless, but they're nowhere walking universe. They're nowhere walking Brahman. They're nowhere totality embodied. They're lost to the process. They're casualties of the process. Depersonalization needs to be addressed and very clearly understood. Depersonalization is precisely because the nervous system, that support of that healthy individuality was not strong enough to vibrate with the high states of consciousness. So we've been thrown out into the recesses where we find ourselves not knowing where we are. But we no longer have any idea of who we were prior to that. And this is a not nice place to be. We don't want to be in these places. Because it's also literally throwing the baby with the water. Moreover, the Ahamkara traditionally was worked on in the domain of ancient civilizations, in the domain of traditions which have been lukewarmed and watered down. Ahamkara played always a very specific role. Ahamkara, for instance, ancient sages it was always known that Ahamkara is that what will allow them to be the masters of the universe. That what will allow them to be precisely that, the vehicles of light here. Because the discrepancy, the separation between the physical and the absolute would be bridged entirely. So the body will become that. Literally, human body will become that through alchemical transformation. It will become the universe itself, with all its corners, peripheries, and galaxies, parallel universes, and whatever there have been discovered or not discovered. And within that domain, within the domain of your own self, which is your own physiology, within your own physiology, the universe will be accessed. Every corner of the universe will be accessed. Every layer of consciousness will be accessed. Why and how? Precisely through the instrumentality of the Ahamkara. Ahamkara is that spacecraft with which ancient riches have traveled. It's that Pushpaka Vimana, Ramayana, it's that literally. This is why I prefer this perspective and this platform, because it's immediately integral right from the beginning, so that you understand that this physiology is already divine, so that we can work from that level, from level of gradual purification, continuously purifying it, so that every change on the level of physiology leads to the changes on the level of your consciousness, and vice versa. This allows greater mastery of this whole process. Just to say, okay, I'm fed up with all this, I'm fed up with myself, I just want to be enlightened. Let me be done with whatever this is here, right? It's not really a healthy process. It's not really. It could backfire. And this is what we would have to address and deal with very carefully, so that we can separate the universal principle responsible for individuation, right, which is sacred. This is what I call in one of my interviews the other face of Shiva. It is sacred. It's just as sacred as the absolute, because it is absolute in disguise as a pair of eyes that behold Shiva. How can that not be sacred? It's for that purpose. I'm beholding myself. That's what this is. I'm beholding myself through everything, through every aperture, through every interaction, continuously. So that is sacred. And that is being supported and sustained and possible because of the healthy Ahamkara. But of course selfishness has to be eradicated. But selfishness goes by itself. Because what is fictitious, what is not real, doesn't have any sway. You see? It doesn't have any sway. It cannot be an obstacle on the process of towards self-realization if we implement rightful modes and rightful methodology. So in other words, instead of working on the ego, let it be. What is not there will simply become more and more transparent. And we'll see through it. And we'll recognize, like I actually, sincerely speaking, cried my eyes out in that state of purification when I was simply realized how selfish I was and how uncareful I was, how unconsiderate I was in my relationship with people and the world. It's also a part of the process. So we go through that. And that opens up the heart, that really moves this process onto another level. Because it's not just ego dies and nothing happens. No. When that selfishness recedes, what opens there is that it's filled with light. There's more light. And that light contains everything what is known as the very, very properties of pure consciousness. Because pure consciousness is not devoid of, is not empty of qualities. It is that which is eternal, it is that which is ever conscious, and that which is ever blissful. And it shines in our own heart. And that of course, in the human language, is that what is love. The true love is being revealed to us within our own heart. Whatever happened to ego? And following in what David has mentioned, and it's precisely as this process matures and unfolds more and more, we return and revisit that which at some point maybe we have considered to be secondary, because we were eager to merge with that light. We've separated the self from the self for that purpose. The witnessing state of consciousness is precisely that. I'm as the self beholding everything, and everything is being viewed and experienced in opposition to my own self. In opposition here not as opposing, but other than my own self. Hence the rupture. But then that rupture, that gap begins to be bridged. How it begins to be bridged? For each and every one in their own terms, in their own way. But as it begins to bridge, it's not just begins to bridge, it's actually being filled with new, qualitatively new experience. It's being filled with light. There's more light. More light. If before it was just a gap between this and that. Before it was just a gap, silent gap. And it was sweet. Between one thought and another thought there was a gap. And there was stillness, there was silence in that. And it was pleasant. Between this experience and that experience there was a gap. But that gap begins to be filled with light. With more and more light. Light of our own awareness. And that light is by its very nature blissful. It has quality, it's blissful. Until all is there is just light. And when there is only light, then the opposition no longer exists. That witnessing state of consciousness simply merges with totally and utterly and completely different state of affairs. A very different state of affairs. And then we begin to rediscover this very intimate affair with the world. And then the true meaning of individuality is being revealed to us. The true meaning of individuality. The true flavor of why am I unique. Because we know already ourselves to be the light onto itself. We already know ourselves to be the light of consciousness. That individuality becomes just as sacred because it has never been anything other than just that. And we go back precisely to that I amness, to that I. Everywhere we turn our head, everywhere we go, is all we can see is I. All we can see is our own self. That is the true definition of Aham. Right? Just we spoke about that, like in Christian tradition. Before Moses, I am. Right? And so it goes. I am that I am. So this is as much as universal identity goes.